I can't be at the Montreal Congress. I'm here in Europe. I'm actually presenting at another Congress today. So it's either an example of good planning or of poor planning, depending on how on which way you look at it. What it does mean is that I'm not at home and I'm in this kind of cellar of sorts. So you're on a ledge closest to what I imagine the direction of the Wi-Fi should be. So I hope that it'll work out. Let me know if you have any connection problems.
For the moment, it seems to be good.
Perfect. Okay, so what I would like to share with you today is this paper that I'm writing. It's a work in progress. I'm writing it as a visiting research at the Max Planck Institute in Cologne, and it's part of my dissertation, my broader doctoral dissertation, which itself is focused on post-war planning in France. And so I'm a historian, so I work a lot with archives, and my argument is that looking at historical precedents of planning efforts and planning infrastructures, administration, teaches us certain things about what we can and can't do, or at least couldn't do back when they were tried, and so it's worth the time, to kind of ponder really what was done in these periods. And so, as some of you may know, France had a large planning apparatus, and so I'll be telling you about that. Yeah, so that's what I'm gonna be telling you about. France had a dirigiste infrastructure created under the Vichy regime, so the regime that was in place during the Second World War, and this dirigiste regime was basically organized to solve shortages. Okay, but it created this kind of administration which could be then used by planners in the post-war to kind of create their own planning authorities. And one of the main planning authorities within the French administration in the post-war was created in 1946, and it was called the General Planning Office, le Commissariat Général au Plan. Maybe some of you have heard about this. It was created by a guy called Jean Monnet, later had very important powers or very important positions within the European Union. Just to tell you quickly what happened, during this so-called Trente Glorieuses period, the post-war period. So you had a level of investment that was, quite high. I say quite high, relatively high, because it's not actually that much higher than the levels of investment that you find today. So you can see that basically between the 1949 and 1966, it averages out around 12% of the gross national product. And today in France, we have approximately 9 to 10%. So it is less now, but it's not that much less, which kind of gives us an idea as to what was happening here. There's a lot of catch-up growth that's going on, which unleashes levels of growth that kind of fall away as we progress up this marginally decreasing return curve. And so these levels of investment did allow for a relatively high level of growth throughout the post-war period. So you can see, it averages out maybe around 6 to 7% in the 50s and 60s. And I guess that the main change is not to have reached these levels of growth, but rather to have stabilized at a level of positive growth. So you can see in the 30s, but if I had pushed back this graph, to the 20s and to before, you'd see the same thing. Previously, you had periods of growth and periods of degrowth, or recession, more it's a better term. And then in the post-war periods, it stabilizes at a growth level. So this is what you really have going on. The way that these investments were being funded is kind of interesting. You can see the distribution of added value. It remains relatively similar, if you exclude the Second World War, which is a logic of its own. But to this day, you still see kind of this general decomposition of added value. You have 2/3 going to labor and 1/3 going to capital. And so these high levels of investment that you have in the post-war are not explained by a redistribution of added value towards capital that can then, invest a lot. So what's happening is one of two things. Either capital is deciding to distribute that third that it does receive differently, i.e., not give, dividends and stuff like that, and rather use that this money to invest, or it's asking for credit, right? And so it's both happen, but it's that second option that really explains a lot of the high levels of investments that you have in the post-war period. This access to planned out and regulated credit that allows industrialists to invest. And so there's a book by Eric Monet that studies this. Perhaps some of you have heard about it. And so you can see this in this graph here. The origins of the investments in France. And so what I want you to kind of take a look at is the lightest color on the bottom there, which are the public funds. So you can see quite clearly on this graph that you have the Marshall Plan period that pushes into the early 1950s, where basically public funds are funding about 60% of total investments in France. It decreases slowly, into the 50s and the 60s with the state progressively, coming out of this high level of control that it has over the economy, but it never really gets under 20% of total investments in at least until 1966, which is the point that my dissertation ends at. So you have throughout this period high levels of state-sponsored investments, and one of the things that I think you need to keep in mind when you look at graphs like this is that when you do decide to invest as a firm, you're often, more times than not, you're getting multiple sources of income. And so what I mean by that is even when you have 20% of investments that are funded by public funds, you're not only seeing 20% of public of investments there, because a lot of investments will take public funds, but will also have self-funding and banking credit and stuff like that. So by controlling this 20% of money, being invested, the state is actually overlooking a lot more than the 20% of investments. So the research questions that I ask is, how did France manage to guide investments in a way that aligned with planners' objectives, right? So you have these planners that write plans, and a lot of the economies remains private. So how does how do the two align? And the second question is, how does long-term planning objectives, medium to long-term, let's say, translate into the day-to-day decisions of firms, to invest? How does a firm decide one day to invest in a way that kind of, generally broadly goes in the direction of planning officials? So what I go through looking at the archives, I go through a lot of state archives, and I've kind of come up with this way of framing what I see using a term, triumvirate. So my argument is that French planning, at least in this period, was organized through three poles, forming a triumvirate. One of the poles is the Ministry of Finance, and under its authority, under the authority of the Ministry of Finance, you have these specialized banks that organize the distribution of credit. Okay, so these specialized banks, some of them still exist. If you guys know the Crédit Agricole, so the agricultural credits, this was one of the specialized banks that was distributing credit to agriculture, of course, but you have the Crédit National that was distributing credit to industry and stuff like that. So that's one pole of the triumvirate, is the distribution of credit. The second pole is technical ministries. So by technical ministries, I mean, the Ministry of Agriculture, Agricultural Affairs, the Ministry of Industry, and within these ministries, you have high-end civil servants that maintain strong links with the firms, supervise their investment decisions, and map out overall production within these within the sectors that they have under their supervision, right? So you have the first one that's first pole distributing the credit, second pole maintaining contact with the firms, and the third pole is the General Planning Commissary, the Commissaire Général au Plan, which provided capital and labor representatives with a space to express their needs. Okay, to say, what do you need to kind of go into investment mode, right? And so the General Planning Commissariat provided the conditions for the creation of what I label growth alliances, right? So these kind of tacit understandings between firms and public officials that, listen, we are going to try to have high levels of investment and make the French economy grow. Okay? Now, this triumvirate remains, exists throughout the period that I'm looking at. It does evolve. Some polls take more importance in some positions, or sometimes, and others at others. I won't get into that too much. What I will do is kind of dive into the Commissariat Général au Plan. So the Commissariat Général au Plan, so the central planning authority, was in Jean Monnet's vision, so the civil servant that created it. It was supposed to be at the heart of what he offered to call a concerted economy, an économie concertée. And so his idea was that within the Commissariat Général au Plan, there would be sectoral modernization commissions. So the Steel Industry Modernization Commission, Agricultural Industry Modernization Commission, etc., which would serve as places to institutionalize communication between representatives of the states, which were tasked with supervising the discussions. There's also union participants tasked with representing their own interests, and there were representatives of private firms, right? And so the idea was that if you get everybody around a table and have them discuss what they need and what they like, you can kind of push through class antagonisms through deliberation. So this was Monnet's idea. And in the immediate post-war in 1946, when the first plan was drafted, it worked quite well. It worked quite well for a number of circumstantial reasons. First one being that industrialists, having collaborated with the occupiers, with the Nazi occupiers, had a little grounds to negotiate what they would like. They had to kind of go along with what planners were saying, and because the country had really been devastated by bombings and stuff like that, union representatives agreed to put aside their strong claims for a while and kind of push for investments. And so in 1946, you can argue that there was some sort of an économie concertée. Perhaps unfortunately for Jean Monnet, but maybe predictably for most, the planning office did not manage to, in the long term, push these class antagonisms aside. In 1947, this social consensus between modernizers, firms, and industrialists and union representatives broke. As the communists were kicked out of government in 1946, the communist-led CGT union was left the planning office, right? And so what's kind of come out of my study, of my historical study of French planning, is that despite this narrative around économie concertée and around this kind of tripartite negotiations where everybody freely joins into these deliberations, what happens is that quite rapidly it becomes a deliberation between firms and the state, and union representatives are out of the picture quite rapidly. Okay, so this is, broadly speaking, this is what you see. You have a number of commissions that is growing as the plan extends. So the more you push into the 60s, the more realms of the economy are find themselves to having a commission to discuss what their needs are. Participants grow as well, but I don't know if you can read this, maybe, but what you see is that the union representatives, so on the top line, actually go down quite, the number of union representatives goes down quite rapidly. And so in the second plan, you have only 34 union representatives out of 304 participants. Right? So if you do rapid calculation, that's about 5% of participants are union representatives. So these are these are single people that are unionists and want to participate in the plan, but they don't have a strong union behind them, right? So they're still participating, but they're not representative of the whole union, right? In the 1960s, you do have a small uptake in union participation. That's due to a number of different factors. One of them being that union participants start receiving a stipend to participate, which kind of helps. If I mean, if you're going to ask union participants or union representatives to participate in planning efforts, and you don't provide them with a way of dealing with the loss of revenue that occurs from going to Paris and spending months on months and months and months writing out a plan, you can expect them to be kind of hesitant in their participation. So there's kind of these efforts that that help participation take up in the 60s. It's also part of a broader debate in some unions on whether or not they should actively engage with the state. I can get back into that, but anyways. Right. So what I want to do now is go and look at specific modernization conditions. So if you follow kind of what I'm trying to do is I gave you a broad outline of planning efforts with this triumvirate. Then I zoomed in onto the planning office. And what I'm going to do now is zoom in even more on the planning office and see two different sectors and see what we can kind of take away from how planning occurred within these two sectors. Okay, so the first sector I'm going to look at is the steel industry. Now, steel industry, like everywhere, is relatively capitally intensive in France, and it's quite concentrated. Okay, and so these two factors make it structurally advantaged in France's planning infrastructure. You have very strong capital ties, very strong ties between capital and the steel bureau of the Ministry of Industries. This was one of the poles of the triumvirate I was talking about. This is represented by one guy. He's called Albert Denis. He headed this steel bureau for almost 2 decades, and he's very typical of the kind of people that you find in these offices in France. Okay, so he's a high-end trained engineer. He's a planning enthusiast. He has strong ties with the industry, and he keeps his positions for decades, right? And so with these kinds of figures within the French administration, you see why you can get a strong, embeddedness between state representatives and firms. Yeah. And so the industry, the steel industry, actually benefits from the state planning apparatus to coordinate its investments. And so what you have is you have steel industrialists participating in the plan, so in the planning office. Okay, so you have a bunch of people representing the steel industry who decide that they're going to use this arena to coordinate their investments. And they do that by writing out a questionnaire, which they send to all steel firms, asking them basically, how much are you going to invest in this production? How much are you going to invest in this production, et cetera, et cetera. All of these questionnaires go back up to Paris to the commission. Everything is assembled, it's anonymized, so nobody knows who is investing what, but they get an idea of how much the sector as a whole is going to invest, right? And then it's sent back down to the firms, okay? So the planning office serves not only as a way to create a plan, but actually to coordinate different actors amongst themselves. Okay, so this is one of the questionnaires. So you can see that there's a separation by year of investments, and then there's separation by type of investment, right? And so this was the kind of thing that these steel industrialists were asked to fill out. Okay, so you can see that in this kind of hyper concentrated industry, the plan served as a coordination kind of arena, right? And agriculture, take another example, has growing capital intensity in this period, but it's very fragmented. It's fragmented in its production. It's fragmented in the sense that there's a lot of producers. And what I like to say is, if you want to get all the steel industrialists around a table, you need a big table, but you can do it. And that's obviously not true for agriculture. And so because of this, agriculture had a harder time to fit within France's planning structure. Okay? So you have some productions that manage better than others to fit in. Wheat and milk specifically, really did manage to kind of coalesce and form these these groups that would communicate well with the state, then you had fruits and maybe surprisingly wine that had a hard time finding a way to kind of organize themselves. And by the same token, because it's such a fragmented sector, it was very difficult to coordinate investments at the national level. And so what emerged was this kind of very large web of administrations that were trying to organize the distribution of credit. So I've mapped out the web. Here it is. You can see that it's supremely complicated. It's so you have these administrations that go down to like rural France, to kind of go and see within these communities farmers, what do you need, how much do you need for a tractor and stuff like that. And so all of this information kind of goes back up towards the technical ministry, which is the Ministry of Agriculture in this case. It gets compared to the objectives from the plan, gets money from the Ministry of Finance, and then the decision, yes or no, goes back down, trickles back down to the farmers, right? And so all of these, all of the points, all of the nodes in this picture are obviously different instances in which capture can occur, in which communication problems occur, and so what this leaves me with is kind of two conclusions. First of all, on the historical front, accounts for planning efforts are never homogeneous and uniform. And so when you do have literatures that kind of push national model narratives, like the ones that famously come out of the Varieties of Capitalism literature, they often fail to kind of show that these sectoral differences exist. And on a more practical front, building upon what the co-panelists have kind of said, seriously studying planning, requires to kind of think about the specific characteristics of each sector and see how each sector or each community or each region, how their material reality interact with, planning authorities that are above them. And so you need to kind of shape planning administrations with all of this in mind. Yeah, I think I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Antoine.